At our wedding reception, while laughter still floated above the hum of conversation and guests clinked their champagne glasses, my father-in-law, Charles Whitmore, suddenly rose from his seat. His movements were abrupt, drawing startled glances from nearby tables. Without a word of courtesy or preamble, he reached over and seized the microphone from Dan's best man. His face was carved from stone tight with something that looked far beyond disapproval. It was deliberate malice. I sat frozen, my fingers intertwined with Dan's beneath the linen-draped table, feeling the thrum of his pulse quicken against my skin. My heart mimicked his rhythm, a chaotic mix of joy nerves and the delicate hope that maybe, just maybe, this night would stay perfect. I had no inkling that Charles was about to dismantle that illusion piece by piece. The barn shimmered with golden fairy lights strung across weathered wooden beams, casting a soft, dreamlike glow over the evening. The tables were alive with chatter stories being swapped, old friendships rekindled, and for the first time in a long while I allowed myself to believe that this happiness, this beautiful, messy, hard-won happiness belonged to us now, ours to keep. Then Charles's voice sliced through the warmth like a blade on silk. "I think everyone here deserves to know the truth," he announced, his voice steady and razor-sharp, cutting through the hum of the celebration. "She's only here for his money." His words hung in the air, cold and heavy, dragging the entire room into a vacuum of silence. Forks paused, mid-bite, glasses halted halfway to lips. Conversations snapped off as though a switch had been thrown. The hum of joy drained from the room, leaving behind a brittle tension. Hundreds of eyes landed on me like floodlights, their gazes brimming with confusion, suspicion, and a tinge of pity. I felt the sting clawing its way up my throat, a burning humiliation blooming in my chest. But I refused to let him see me break. I forced a smile tight, brittle, and sharp-edged, because tears would only feed his hunger for control. Dan's grip on my hand tightened, his jaw clenched, his body rigid beside me, bracing against the blow. Neither of us moved, rooted in place, anchored together as the storm rolled in. Charles stood tall, shoulders back, savoring the silence he had manufactured, as if each second fed his pride. His smirk grew cruel and satisfied. I wanted desperately to stand to defend myself, to tell the room who I really was. Not some social climber, not a woman scheming for status, but a survivor who had rebuilt her life from the ashes, who had earned everything through grit and sacrifice. But I remained still. Sometimes I had learned silence was louder than words, sharper than retorts. The guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. I heard whispers ripple like waves, but most people simply stared, their faces frozen in a stunned paralysis. And then, almost unnoticed at first, Owen slid quietly from his seat. My 8-year-old son wiped his hands on his navy slacks napkin, still dangling from his shirt collar, and walked steadily toward the microphone, cutting through the crowd with a courage far bigger than his small frame. He looked tiny under the towering barn beams, the lights painting his hair in soft gold, but his steps never faltered. I instinctively half rose, panic flaring in my chest, heart pounding, ready to pull him back, to shield him from the ugliness erupting in the room. But Owen turned and locked eyes with me, steady, calm, certain. There was no fear in his expression, only a quiet determination that froze me in place. He stopped just a few feet from Charles, staring up at the man who had publicly humiliated his mother. His voice, though small, was clear, each word carrying through the hushed room like a bell. Grandpa Owen said evenly, his tone not confrontational but cutting in its simplicity. "Should I tell them what you did to Grandma Maggie?" The effect was immediate. The air cracked open like a fault line. A glass slipped from someone's trembling hand, shattering on the hardwood floor, the sound ricocheting like gunfire. Gasps echoed against the timber walls. Every ounce of attention that had once been aimed like arrows at me now swung violently toward Charles. He opened his mouth, lips moving, but no sound emerged. His face blanched to the color of ash. For the first time that evening, I wasn't the one on trial. The truth that had festered in the dark corners of this family for years clawed its way to the surface, and I knew it wouldn't be me who paid the price. The morning of the wedding broke like a whispered promise. The world outside my bedroom window, painted in soft golden hues that stretched across the open fields, bathing the landscape in a tender warmth that seemed to reach straight into my chest. Wildflowers, those stubborn, beautiful rebels, dotted the meadow beyond the fence, their delicate petals swaying gently beneath the breath of an early summer breeze. It was the kind of morning that belonged to storybooks, the kind I had once believed were written for other people. Standing in front of the antique mirror that had belonged to my grandmother, I adjusted the simple pearl earrings Dan had given me on our first anniversary together. My fingers trembled slightly, betraying the undercurrent of nerves that hummed just beneath my skin. The reflection that stared back at me wore a smile small cautious, but behind it danced 1,000 memories, some too painful to name others, tender enough to make my breath hitch. I had never imagined I would find myself here on the cusp of a second chance at love, and certainly not one that felt this pure, this fiercely honest. After the wreckage of my first marriage left to suffocate in the dark corners of deceit and loneliness, I had long since convinced myself that fairy tales were written for other women, women with easier pasts and fewer scars. For me, life had become about survival, about building something steady and safe for Owen and me, laying each brick carefully, painfully, with hands worn raw from doing it all alone. And then, like a door cracked open to a world I thought I'd locked away forever, Dan had walked into our lives. We met in the least romantic of places, his architecture firm's sterile, gray-walled offices, where I had been hired to breathe life into their interiors. Dan, ever the listener, the quiet observer, made me feel like every idea I voiced mattered, like I wasn't just another name in his inbox. Over shared coffees in paper cups and long nights sketching floor plans beneath flickering fluorescent lights, something unexpected unfolded between us. Friendship gave way to something warmer, something steady and undeniable, like a river that had always known where it was going, even if I hadn't. Dan never tried to fix me. He simply stood beside me, unwavering, showing up with small everyday acts of tenderness, the way he always kept my favorite mint tea stocked in his kitchen, the way he laughed at Owen's endless stream of corny jokes like they were treasures. And Owen's sweet, cautious. Owen had adored him almost from the start. They built Lego castles that sprawled across the living room carpet, fought epic foam sword battles under the sunset, and whispered conspiratorial secrets about the treehouse they would build for me just because. Watching them together filled me with an ache so profound it felt like worship. But in every fairy tale there is a shadow, and ours came in the form of Charles Whitmore, Dan's father, the man who had never once hidden his disdain for me. To him, I was a walking cliché, a single mother with nothing but a pretty face and a bank account scraping bottom. His smiles were like barbed wire wrapped in silk, and his compliments carried the sting of a slap. At the rehearsal dinner, he kept his distance, orbiting the edges of the room like a shark circling prey, glass of scotch in hand, his laughter reserved for old business partners and country club friends, never for us. I told myself I didn't care. That Dan's love and Owen's trust were the only approval I needed. But the truth was a tight, sour knot that twisted low in my stomach every time I caught Charles watching me from across the room, his expression as opaque as glass. Still, the wedding day unfolded like the dream I had dared to wish for. The venue, a lovingly restored barn, stood like an old guardian wrapped in soft linen and glittering fairy lights, cradled by towering oaks whose branches whispered of protection and endurance. Tables draped in ivory linens were dressed with blush-pink roses and gleaming gold-rimmed china, and everywhere there was warmth, the kind that seeped into your bones and whispered of home. I wore a dress that skimmed the floor like a breath of air, lace and satin that needed no embellishment because it felt finally like it belonged to me. Dan, devastating in his navy suit, wore a white rose in his lapel, a mirror of the one I carried in my bouquet. And when I walked down the aisle and met his eyes, saw the way they softened, the way he looked at me, as if I were the only soul in the universe, every fracture inside me seemed to knit itself whole again. Our vows were not scripted fairy tales. They were promises carved from the rough, messy truths of real life. We vowed to fight for each other, to listen, even when it was hard to forgive, even when it felt impossible. Owen stood proudly beside us, the rings trembling slightly in his hands as he grinned so wide I thought he might split in two from sheer joy. The cocktail hour that followed brimmed with laughter, the air filled with the scent of roasted peaches, and champagne children chasing each other barefoot across the lawn as dusk painted the sky in lavender streaks. For a fleeting, glorious moment, the scars of my past faded into something weightless, invisible, as though joy itself had made them disappear. But joy, as I had learned, was fragile. It was during the speeches that the first crack appeared. I nestled against Dan's side, basking in the warmth of his presence, as the best man cracked jokes about Dan's culinary disasters, and my maid of honor told stories of teenage wedding daydreams that had turned out far messier and more beautiful than we'd ever imagined. I caught sight of Charles out of the corner of my eye, sitting like a statue at his table, swirling his glass of amber liquid with a precise, almost menacing patience. For a fleeting moment, I dared to believe he would let us have this night, that he might, out of some sliver of decency, keep his bitterness bottled away until morning. I was wrong. When Charles rose, taking the microphone into his hand, the shift in the room was subtle at first, a ripple of confusion, the turn of heads, the expectant hush of guests awaiting a formal, perhaps slightly stiff, father of the groom toast. What came instead shattered the delicate peace we had built like a hammer to glass. A few guests, perhaps clinging to politeness or simply caught off guard, offered hesitant applause, expecting as I had a stiff and forgettable father of the groom speech, a relic of tradition, mildly awkward and quickly endured. Instead, Charles Whitmore detonated the entire evening with a single well-aimed sentence that fractured the fragile beauty of our celebration in an instant. And now, sitting here beneath the oppressive weight of it, the barn's candle-lit warmth turning brittle around me, I understood with a clarity that struck like cold steel to the chest. This wasn't a toast, nor a blundered attempt at fatherly wisdom. This was a strike, a calculated ambush, a precision attack meant to crush me beneath the very lights meant to bless our union. He had chosen this moment, this sacred, vulnerable hour, to deliver his blow where it would cut the deepest. And for one terrible, breathless beat, it almost worked. But sometimes the most profound strength in a room doesn't come from those wielding microphones or standing at podiums. Sometimes it rises from the smallest corners, the smallest voices, the smallest hearts refusing to be silenced. Owen James, with his sure, quiet steps, reminded me of that truth. That the love which holds its ground despite fear, despite trembling hands, is the love that endures. Charles's accusation hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. She's only after his money. For a single, suffocating heartbeat, the entire room stood frozen, suspended in the eerie silence that follows an earthquake. Even the band, caught mid-tune-up, abandoned their instruments, letting the barn fall into a hush so absolute I could hear the faint buzzing of the fairy lights strung above us. Conversations died on parted lips. Faces turned toward me, not with warmth, but with suspicion, with unease, with that awful hollow pity reserved for women exposed and stripped bare in public. I felt them all, every gaze, every whispered thought, as if they had been etched onto my skin. Beside me, Dan's hand remained clenched around mine, his knuckles gone bone-white, his body vibrating with barely contained fury. I could feel the tension radiating off him, a storm gathering behind his eyes, but neither of us moved, trapped in the eye of this cruel tempest. I wanted desperately to rise, to laugh it off with something sharp and disarming, to throw his words back at him with the power they deserved. But the words tangled in my throat like thorns. I had braced myself for many things on this day, rain, a torn dress, a speech gone awkward, but never this. Never the venom of a man determined to humiliate me before those I loved most. Dan began to rise, half out of his chair, ready to confront his father, but Charles pressed on his voice, an oily thread filling every corner of the barn, smooth and deliberate like the smoke of an expensive cigar curling into the rafters. My son Charles intoned his gaze, lingering on Dan with the weight of a challenge before sweeping the assembled guests, has always been cursed with a heart too big. And it blinds him, you see, it blinds him to the truth of what people really want from him. Murmurs rippled across the tables like uneasy waves. Friends exchanged glances, their hands stilling over their wine glasses, unsure if they should rise, should intervene, or simply sit frozen in the wreckage unfolding before them. A few glanced my way, their eyes holding something close to apology, but most simply waited hungry perhaps for more. My breath came quicker now, shallow, ragged, as if the satin and lace of my gown, which had felt so light, so effortless only hours ago, had become a net cinching around my chest, pulling tighter with every word Charles spat. He raised his glass as if mocking a toast, the amber liquid catching the flicker of the candlelight, his smile thin as a blade. "Here's to seeing things clearly," he sneered before it's too late. Then, with a flourish that felt like the final twist of a knife, he dropped the microphone onto the table. The clatter echoed through the barn, filling the void left in his wake, like the crash of a gavel. I sat, paralyzed, staring down at the plate before me, its contents now blurred and absurd. A lone cherry tomato had rolled to the far edge, perched precariously, as if mocking the normalcy of it all amidst the chaos swirling around it. Around me the world spun and tilted, but that ridiculous tomato remained still a tiny, cruel anchor to a reality I no longer recognized. Dan turned toward me, his face flushed red, not just with rage, but with heartbreak. His hand found mine again, trembling now. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, the words cracked and raw-soaked in helplessness. But I shook my head fiercely. No, I would not allow him to carry the weight of his father's cruelty. This shame was not his, not ours. I straightened my spine, lifting my chin, forcing myself upright despite the quiver in my knees. If Charles Whitmore had meant to humiliate me, I would not crumble under his gaze. I would meet him head-on, steel for steel. My mouth opened, words gathering at the back of my throat, ready to lash back to reclaim my dignity in front of them all. But before a sound could escape me, Owen moved. From the next table over, where he had been sitting beside my sister Sarah and her children, Owen stood brushing invisible crumbs from the front of his tiny navy slacks. For a split second, I assumed he was simply coming to me, seeking the comfort a child instinctively reaches for when the world turns sharp and frightening. I began to rise, arms halfway outstretched, ready to gather him in to shield him from the ugliness consuming the room. But Owen didn't come to me. He walked steady measured with the quiet resolve of someone much older than his 8 years straight toward the microphone. The room seemed to hold its breath, a hush, falling over the guests like a velvet curtain as they turned to watch him. This small boy in his clip-on tie and slightly crooked vest, standing alone beneath the glare of the overhead lights, claimed the space that Charles had tried to dominate. Owen's small fingers reached for the microphone with the quiet determination of someone who understood the weight of silence and the power of a single, well-placed truth. He adjusted it carefully, the metal stand wobbling slightly under his touch, but his gaze never wavered, as he lifted his chin and faced Charles Whitmore head-on. His voice, though soft, carried a clarity that sliced through the thick, choking tension in the room, like the clean, sudden crack of thunder across an open field. "Grandpa," he said, steady and sure, his words unadorned but sharp as glass. "Should I tell them what you did to Grandma Maggie?" The air inside the barn fractured. There was an audible gasp as though the room itself recoiled from the boy's words, from the simple, devastating precision of them. A woman at a nearby table let out a strangled sob, clamping a trembling hand over her mouth. At another table, someone's wine glass tipped from nerveless fingers, the crimson liquid bleeding into the pristine white linen like a wound laid bare for all to see. Charles, who only moments ago sat puffed with smug superiority, commanding the attention of the room with all the confidence of a king issuing decrees, now turned ashen. His mouth opened, but the words faltered, caught somewhere between shock and fear, as though he had been stripped naked beneath the harsh lights, every armor of arrogance peeled away by the smallest person in the room. He scanned Owen's face, then the guests', his eyes darting frantically as if searching for someone, anyone who might still defend him, who might dismiss the boy's words as childish fiction. But the answer, clear and brutal, stared back at him from every horrified face. No one would rescue him from the truth now clawing its way to the surface. I sat frozen, my breath trapped high in my chest, torn between an aching surge of pride and a maternal terror that twisted through my ribcage. Owen stood there, a solitary figure beneath the swaying fairy lights, dwarfed by the towering beams and the endless sea of adult eyes fixed upon him, yet he did not waver. His hands clasped tightly in front of him, his small shoulders squared against the invisible storm, swirling through the room. He did not raise his voice or cry or plead for anyone to believe him. He simply stood illuminating the darkest corners of the room with a bravery that stole the breath from my lungs. Dan moved first, his chair scraping back against the wooden floor, with a jolt that snapped the spell holding everyone in place. He crossed the room, every step radiating quiet strength, until he stood beside Owen, placing a steady hand on the boy's trembling shoulder. His gaze never left his father's, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, but beneath the calmness coiled a steel that dared Charles to deny what had been spoken aloud. "You heard him," Dan said, his tone measured, yet weighted with an authority that cut deeper than any shout. "Maybe it's time we all heard the truth. The guests remained silent, motionless, as if the barn itself had transformed into a courtroom, suspended in the liminal space between past and present, between what they had chosen to ignore and what they could no longer look away from. Eyes darted between Charles and Dan, between the man who had long held their respect and the son who now stripped away every layer of deception with the help of a small, unshakable boy. For the first time since Charles had seized the microphone and poisoned the room with his words, I allowed myself to smile, not because the ache in my chest had faded, not because the moment had softened, but because we were no longer standing alone in the wreckage. Owen had made sure of that. And now Charles sat stiffly in his chair, mute and shrunken, while the weight of my son's truth settled over the room like a suffocating fog. His hands, once so steady as they gripped his glass with an air of effortless control, now trembled visibly against the fine linen tablecloth, betraying the unraveling of a man who had never imagined the day would come, when the lies he so carefully built would be undone, not by an adult, not by one of his peers, but by a child. A child he had dismissed, underestimated, ignored. And in that moment, the balance of power shifted forever. The man who had for so long relished his place as judge and executioner within his family now sat cornered, stripped of his power, exposed beneath the harsh, unrelenting gaze of the people he had once commanded with mere looks and insinuations. Charles Whitmore's mask cracked his bravado, draining from him as visibly as the color from his face. Dan knelt beside Owen, lowering himself to the boy's level, his hand gentle as he cupped the back of his neck, his words low but brimming with the kind of reverence usually reserved for warriors returning from battle. "You were so brave," he murmured, his voice thick with the raw ache of a father's pride. "You did the right thing, Owen. Never forget that." Owen nodded once, slow and solemn, his face a mask of seriousness far beyond his years. He did not shuffle his feet, did not twist his hands the way other children might. He simply stood there, grounded, anchored, as though he understood with aching clarity the weight of what he had done and why it mattered. I rose from my chair on legs that still trembled, the fine fabric of my dress rustling softly as I smoothed it with unsteady hands. Each step toward them felt like wading through water, my heart a wild drumbeat against my ribs. When I reached them, I folded Owen into my arms, pulling him close, feeling the steady thrum of his heartbeat syncing with my own. Dan rose too, enclosing us both in his arms, forging a circle that felt as unbreakable as iron forged in fire. But the silence was punctured by Charles's voice, no longer booming, and sure but rough-edged and defensive, stumbling over itself like a man grasping at the last threads of a fraying rope. "He's just a child," he barked, though the strength he had once wielded was gone from his tone, replaced by something that sounded dangerously close to desperation. "He doesn't know what he's talking about." Dan's spine straightened, his voice cutting through the tension like tempered steel. "He didn't raise it. He didn't have to." "Then maybe," he said, his tone smooth as it was merciless, "you should explain it to us, Dad. Explain what Owen heard. Explain why Mom was terrified to come home after her surgery. Why she called me sobbing, begging me to stay on the line because she couldn't bear to be alone in the same house with you." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Gasps echoed across the tables. Guests whispered behind trembling hands, glancing from Charles to me to Dan, their faces stretched between disbelief and dawning horror. I tightened my grip on Owen, holding him fiercely against me, my gaze never breaking from Charles's. I wanted him to see that his reign of fear had ended, that there would be no place for his shadows to hide anymore. Then, with a harsh, scraping noise that sent a shiver across the barn's wooden floors, Charles stood, abruptly knocking his chair backward with a violence that betrayed the storm raging inside him. His face twisted into something grotesque anger, yes, but beneath it a raw, unmasked fear now visible for all to see. "This is a family matter," he spat, his voice losing its steadiness. "Not something to parade in front of strangers." Dan's response was quiet, but its weight filled every corner of the barn. "No, Dad," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Family matters are built on trust, respect, love. You threw those away long before tonight." For a heartbeat, I thought Charles might bolt, might disappear into the dark, leaving behind Whisper's wreckage and the comfortable lies people told themselves to avoid facing the truth. But he didn't move. He stood frozen, rooted not by dignity, but by the stubborn pride that refused to admit defeat, even when the war had already been lost. From one of the front tables, a quiet rustle of movement broke the stillness. Robert, known to the family as Uncle Bob, rose to his feet. The man had always been a shadow at gatherings, a figure content to linger at the edges, his presence more habit than force. But tonight something in him broke free. "I heard it too," Bob said, his voice quivering with long-restrained emotion. "I was there the night you told Maggie she was a burden, that you wished the stroke had finished the job." His voice faltered, thick with unshed grief. "I stayed quiet because I thought saying something would break this family apart. But the truth is, you already did that yourself, Charles." The words shattered what little remained of Charles's composure. His mouth opened and closed, desperate to summon a defense, to find some thread of authority he could still grasp, but there was none left. Around him, the guests no longer looked at him with confusion. They stared at him with disgust, with anger, with the bitter sorrow of people forced to confront a truth they had ignored for far too long. The murmurs grew rippling through the crowd like a tide, turning into waves of outrage and pity for the woman Charles had failed so utterly. The wedding planner, sharp-eyed and discreet, motioned toward the security team posted near the entrance, sensing that the night's unraveling had crossed into territory from which there would be no graceful return. Two men in black suits appeared silently at the back of the room, their presence calm but firm, waiting for the inevitable. Dan glanced at them, then back to his father. His voice, when he spoke again, was steady, stripped of the anger, now replaced by something colder. "I think you should leave," he said simply. "You're not welcome here." Charles looked around and for the first time perhaps understood the completeness of his isolation. No allies remained, no sympathetic faces met his gaze. There would be no savior, no whispered justifications. Only the cold collective judgment of those who had seen him for what he truly was. With jerky mechanical movements, he grabbed his coat from the back of his chair and stalked toward the door. No one clapped, no one called after him. The heavy wooden doors closed behind him with a sound that echoed like a final, irrevocable sentence. For a long, aching moment, silence lingered, heavy and electric. Then Dan turned back to the guests, his voice raw but clear as he spoke, not from the podium but from his heart. "This woman," he said, turning to me, his eyes soft with something fierce and unwavering, "is the love of my life. She is not here for anything but my heart. And I am proud beyond words to call her my wife." Tears blurred my vision again, but this time they carried no shame, no humiliation. They were tears of something searing and bright and alive. The guests rose, applause filling the barn, not the stiff, polite clapping of social obligation, but something louder, fuller, cathartic. People cheered, some wept openly, and in the center of it all stood Owen, the smallest among us, yet the bravest, his hand clutching mine, his small palm fitting perfectly against mine, as if reminding me that we were no longer just surviving. We were reclaiming our family, and as the heavy doors sealed Charles Whitmore from our lives, the air in the room shifted, lightened, like the lifting of a terrible weight that had pressed upon our chests for far too long. The change in the room did not come all at once. It moved slowly, like the first hesitant breath after a long-held silence, delicate and uncertain, yet undeniable. For a suspended moment, the entire crowd remained frozen, as if collectively stranded in the debris of what had been shattered, unsure whether to step forward or simply stand still, clutching their fractured assumptions. Dan turned toward me then, and when our eyes met, there was no trace of anger left in his. Only love. Fierce, defiant, unshakable love that glowed from him like the golden warmth of the lights strung above us. He closed the distance between us in a few steps, reaching for both my hands, folding them tightly into his, pulling me into a space that was suddenly ours alone, the quiet between the echoes of gasps and the uncertain rustling of silverware. "I love you," he whispered, the words strong, unwavering, a lifeline thrown into the churning sea. "Nothing anyone says, nothing anyone does will ever change that." And this time when the tears rose, I did not swallow them down. I let them fall freely, unashamed, because this was no longer the same woman who had been accused and humiliated. I was still standing, stronger than before. And in front of everyone, Dan leaned in and kissed me slow, gentle, sealing a vow far more sacred than any whispered under archways or penned into wedding vows. This promise had nothing to do with appearances or approval. It was raw. It was real. Beside us, Owen clutched my hand, his face radiant, his smile wide enough to light the shadows that lingered at the corners of the barn. In his small way, he had become the fiercest protector in the room, braver than men 3 times his size, braver than most adults dared to be. From the far end of the room, my sister Sarah began to clap tentatively at first, as if testing the strength of the fragile moment. But soon others joined her, the sound swelling, growing into something uncontainable applause that filled the barn loud and whole, a chorus of relief and solidarity. It was not polite nor forced. It was alive. It was healing. The band, after a moment of confused hesitation, glanced toward Dan for confirmation. When he gave them a simple nod, they began to play the song we had chosen together in happier days. The opening notes of Stand By Me floated through the air, rich, steady, grounding us all in its familiar comfort. Dan turned to me with a crooked smile and extended his hand. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Whitmore?" he asked, his voice teasing, but his eyes burning with sincerity. I laughed, shaky but genuine, and placed my hand in his, letting him lead me onto the dance floor. The guests, as if by silent agreement, formed a wide circle around us, giving us the space we needed, offering their quiet, wordless support. Above us, the fairy lights swayed softly in the evening breeze, drifting through the open barn doors, carrying the scent of roses and damp summer grass, mingling with the notes of the music and the rhythm of our hearts. As we danced, Dan leaned in his lips, brushing my ear. "You and me," he whispered, his breath warm against my skin. "No one else matters." I clung to him tighter, grounding myself in the solid truth of his embrace, in the certainty of his words that wrapped around me like armor. Halfway through the song, Owen scampered toward us, his small arms circling my waist. Without hesitation, Dan scooped him up, holding him between us, and the 3 of us turned together under the lights, our laughter threading into the music, stitching the torn night back together. Around us, the reception breathed again. Conversations restarted, brighter, freer, unburdened. Friends and family returned to their tables, their chatter rising above the clinking of glasses, the scrape of plates as they refilled their dinners. Children chased each other barefoot across the lawn, their joyous shrieks cutting through the dusk like bells. The world, it seemed, refused to be poisoned by one bitter man's hate. My Aunt Barbara appeared by my side, then her smile soft, her eyes glistening. She pressed a kiss to my cheek, whispering, "You are exactly where you're meant to be, Claire." Later that night, beneath the silver shimmer of stars spilling across the sky, the party spilled onto the cool grass outside. People approached us in waves, some to apologize for Charles's behavior, others to offer gentle words of encouragement, but many simply hugged us, no words needed. And I realized, standing there under that vast, forgiving sky, that cruelty does not define us. It is how we rise after it that shows who we truly are. Owen stayed close to my side the rest of the evening, his small hand finding mine whenever the noise and crowds became too much. I bent down, kissed the top of his head, breathing in the scent of him, soap and grass and innocence. "You saved me today," I whispered. He looked up at me, his brow furrowed in confusion. "I just told the truth," he said, simply shrugging as if he didn't yet understand the enormity of what he'd done. Sometimes, the purest courage comes from the smallest voices. When the night finally dwindled and we drove away beneath a tunnel of sparklers, I looked back at the barn glowing in the distance, and I felt no sadness, no fear. We had walked through the fire, the 3 of us, and emerged not just intact, but stronger. This was our beginning, and no shadow of doubt, no whisper of hate would ever take it from us again. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the bedroom window, casting honey-colored patterns across the sheets where Owen slept, curled at my side. Dan's arm draped over both of us, his breathing steady, grounding me in the soft hush of a new day. I lay there, still letting the weight of everything settle the chaos of the night before the pain, the humiliation. It should have broken us, but instead, it had revealed something unshakable, something deeper than I had dared believe existed. Later, as the day stretched out before us, Dan and I sat on the back porch with coffee warming our hands wrapped in a blanket, watching the world wake up. The fields beyond our little home glimmered with dew, the air still sharp, freshly scrubbed by the storm we had weathered. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," Dan said quietly, his voice laced with regret. "You didn't deserve any of it." I leaned into him, smiling. "I'm not sorry," I answered, surprising even myself with the truth of it. If Charles had stayed silent, we might have spent years under a cloud of quiet disapproval, always wondering what was being whispered behind closed doors, always guarding our happiness like it was made of glass. Instead, the worst had been dragged into the light, seen, named, and most importantly, rejected. Not just by us, but by everyone who mattered. Dan kissed my forehead, and we sat in that golden morning knowing we had earned our peace. And as the weeks unfurled like new leaves, something unexpected blossomed. Friends who had once kept their distance drifted closer. Invitations arrived for dinners, birthdays, game nights. People who had once stayed at the edges of our lives now reached out with open hands. Even Uncle Bob, who had once buried his head in silence to keep peace, took Dan aside at a family barbecue, his voice thick with emotion, and apologized for staying silent so long. "It won't be like that anymore," he promised, and it wasn't. In the absence Charles left behind, something beautiful filled the space. Honesty, support, the messy, glorious connections of a family, no longer walking on eggshells. Stories of Margaret Whitmore, once whispered in hushed, guilt-tinged tones, now came pouring out in laughter and tears. Stories of her strength, her stubbornness, her fierce love. Through it all, Owen grew. He asked questions about truth, about bravery, and we answered as best we could. Always honest, always careful to teach him that speaking the truth isn't about punishment, but about healing. One night, as I tucked him into bed, he looked up at me, his voice small. "I was scared when I said it, Mom. I thought, maybe you'd be mad." I brushed the hair back from his forehead, smiling softly. "I could never be mad at you for telling the truth," I whispered. "You were braver than most grown-ups that night." He smiled, then the tiniest, proudest smile, and closed his eyes, drifting into sleep. And I sat there watching him, realizing that this imperfect, messy, beautiful life was exactly what I wanted. Not perfect, not pain-free, but real. Built on foundations strong enough to survive any storm. Months later, when Dan officially adopted Owen, the judge, kind-eyed and gentle, asked if Owen wanted to say anything before the papers were signed. Owen, standing tall between us in his best button-up shirt, nodded solemnly. "I just want to say," he announced in that clear, steady voice, "that Dan's always been my real dad, even before today." And in that courtroom, not a single person kept their eyes dry. The judge's smile was soft, knowing, as though he too felt the weight of what this moment meant, not just for us, but for Owen, for all the cracks in our family that had finally found the courage to heal. There wasn't a dry eye in that room, not among the officials, nor among the handful of friends and family who had stood witness to something more sacred than paperwork. When we stepped out of the courthouse, the heavy clouds that had lingered all morning split open, and sunlight streamed down on us warm and golden, as if the universe itself wanted to wrap us in its embrace. We stood there on the steps, hand in hand, hearts lighter than they had been in years, and for a fleeting moment I let myself believe it was a sign. But perhaps it wasn't. Perhaps it was simply the truth we had carried all along, now made visible for everyone to see. Because family, I realized, is not bound by blood alone. It is forged in choice and love that stands firm when the ground shakes beneath your feet, in the courage to speak the truth even when your voice quivers, even when the fear claws at your throat. That day at the reception, when Charles Whitmore had tried so viciously to drive a wedge between us, he had, without ever intending, to given us a gift. He forced us to strip away every pretense, to reveal, without armor or disguise, exactly who we were to each other and to the world watching. His words had not broken us, they had forged us, and from that fire we walked forward into a future that was not only ours, but bolder, braver, and more beautiful than anything we had dared to dream before. If you've walked this far with me through the pain, through the wreckage, through the truth that refused to stay buried, thank you. Thank you for sitting with this story, for letting these words linger in your heart. And if they touched something in you, if they stirred that quiet belief that love and truth can still triumph over cruelty and fear, I hope you'll take a moment to let me know. It means more than I can ever say. Perhaps you too have a story waiting to be told, a story of second chances, of battles fought in silence, of victories whispered when no one was looking. I would be honored if you shared it in the space below. Your words might be the spark someone else needs to find their voice, to remember that courage often comes from the smallest, most unexpected places. And if you know someone, anyone who might need that reminder tonight, share this with them. You never know whose life you might touch. This may feel like the end, but I promise you, it's just the beginning. There are more stories waiting to be told, more hearts waiting to be heard, and I would be grateful, truly grateful, to have you along for every step of this journey. So if you want to hear more stories about love, about family, about the quiet battles we fight to protect what matters most, I hope you'll stay with me. There's more to come. Thank you for believing. Thank you for standing in the light with me. We'll see each other again soon.